You were once a smart child. So why do you feel lost now? There was a time when everything seemed effortless. You learned quickly, understood deeply, and were praised as someone born to succeed. But as life stopped following the formulas you once knew, that intelligence became a burden. You know so much, yet somehow you no longer know who you are. Perhaps you're living the paradox of intellect. The more you understand, the lonelier you become. The more you try to control, the more direction you lose. And somewhere deep within, a quiet voice whispers, "Am I truly living, or merely thinking about living?" In this video, we'll look deeply into the curse of intelligence, to understand why the very reason once saved us now imprisons us. And more importantly, how you don't need to be smarter. You only need to be truer to rediscover yourself. Why do smart children grow up to be lonely and lost? A simple question, yet it touches a profound paradox within the modern human psyche. Behind the brilliance of intellect, there always lies a fragile crack, where being clever ceases to be a blessing and becomes the curse of separation. From an early age, smart kids are wrapped in praise. Each achievement, each word of recognition becomes a mirror through which they define their worth. But as Alan Watts once said, the more we try to define ourselves, the more we confine ourselves. And so when intelligence becomes the definition of who you are, you lose the ability to simply be human. They learn fast, understand deeply, and grow to believe that life should operate with logical simplicity. If I'm smart, everything should be easy, they tell themselves. But life, as Watts reminds us, is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. The world isn't a puzzle awaiting an answer. It's a river of experience. As these bright children grow up and touch the raw complexity of life, every logical equation collapses. And with it, the self-image built upon being intelligent begins to fracture. The pain isn't in failure itself, it's in the collapse of identity. When they struggle, their first feeling isn't sadness, but shame. Shame for finding things difficult. Shame for having to try. In that moment, they forget what Alan Watts said in The Wisdom of Insecurity. To understand yourself, you must stop trying to be what you think you should be. Yet the smart child doesn't stop. They try to become the intelligent version of themselves, even in suffering. And so praise becomes the first chain. When a child is defined by their difference, they grow up fearing being ordinary. But it is within ordinariness that we find connection, softness, and the quiet grace of being human. Intellect, without humility, becomes an ivory tower of isolation. Alan Watts once said, "Trying to be extraordinary is the most ordinary thing in the world." And the more we try to stand out, the more we resemble the millions who are also running from themselves. The curse of intelligence doesn't lie in knowing too much, but in identifying with that knowing. Then we no longer see the world through the innocent eyes of experience, but through the judgmental gaze of ego. And that's where the first loneliness begins, not because no one understands us, but because we've lost the ability to truly be present with ourselves. Yet the tragedy doesn't end with the curse of intelligence. When that once bright child steps into adulthood, a world where success is no longer measured by grades but by endurance, they encounter what Alan Watts called the great deception of the ego. The ego, for them, was born from those early praises, from the image of the smart child others once attached to them. Now, when they face failure for the first time, they don't merely fear losing an opportunity, they fear losing themselves. Alan Watts said, "The ego is nothing more than the focus of conscious attention." But once we believe I am that image, any crack in it feels like the entire inner world is collapsing. Thus, when life becomes difficult, the smart child doesn't see challenges, they see threats to their identity. And within their mind echoes the frightened whisper, "If I have to try, it means I'm not smart anymore." That thought turns every effort into proof of failure. To escape the pain of imperfection, they begin to build walls. They avoid new experiences, fearing that failure will shatter the talented image. They only do what they're already good at, because the comfort zone is the last place they still feel in control. And they withdraw from real relationships, afraid of being seen in their moments of weakness and fracture. The truth is, the child who once mastered every test must now face the greatest test of all, to live not as an idea, but as a being. Because beyond all intelligence, beyond the masks of cleverness and control, lies the simple, raw, radiant truth of existence, that you were never meant to be smart enough, only alive enough. That's when intelligence becomes a prison. Watts once said, "The more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless." The more we strive to preserve a perfect image of ourselves, the more we lose the living pulse of who we truly are. The ego, once created to protect us, gradually becomes our ruler, forcing us to play the role of the one who understands, even when we're lost inside our own minds. The trap of the ego lies here. It makes us believe we are in control, when in truth we are controlled by our fear of losing control. The smart child has now grown up, but still carries that trembling child within, afraid of being discovered as no different from anyone else. They try to prove their worth through achievements, through intellect, through the masks of knowledge. But the more they try to prove, the further they drift from their authentic essence, the part of them that simply longs to be, not to be praised. And then the breaking point appears. Intellectual pride transforms into emotional isolation. In the pursuit of being extraordinary, they lose the ability to feel the beauty of the ordinary, where life truly blooms. Watts once said, "We are all playing games, but the trouble is we take them too seriously." And they forget that the game of intellect is only one aspect of life, not the totality of existence. When the ego has taken the stage, the smart child forgets how to step down and simply live as a real human being. After withdrawing into the safe zone of understanding, they enter the deeper phase of tragedy, intellectual loneliness. If the previous stage was the trap of the ego, this is the price of staying in it too long. To avoid being hurt, they retreat from genuine connections. But this retreat does not come from peace, it comes from fear. And fear, as Alan Watts said, is the result of trying to cling to life instead of flowing with it. When the mind tries to grasp life through intellect, it loses the ability to flow with it. The smart child grows into an analyst, not a connector. They read people through logic, predict emotions through behavior, and interpret every reaction in the language of psychology. But the more they understand, the further they drift away. As Watts wrote in the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, we seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own. Intellect makes them believe they're understanding others, when in reality, they're only analyzing reflections of themselves. When reason overwhelms the heart, connection becomes performance. They may say the right things, laugh at the right moments, and react intelligently, yet feel hollow inside. They understand others but cannot feel them. They communicate skillfully but are inwardly exhausted. They try to fix loneliness with logic, but as Watts reminds us, you can't get rid of loneliness by thinking about it. Reason cannot heal emotion because it is the very wall that separates us from it. And when every attempt at connection fails, they fall into defensive arrogance. "I'm not lonely," they tell themselves. "I'm just different, too deep for others to understand." But behind that mask lies a heart afraid of being hurt, afraid of being seen as vulnerable. The intelligent ego becomes the gatekeeper of loneliness, guarding the door where true affection once lived. Alan Watts once said, "We are lonely because we are afraid of intimacy." We are not truly afraid of being alone, we are afraid of being seen, afraid of dissolving the boundary between me and the other. And it is that very separation that prevents the smart child from ever touching real closeness, even when surrounded by a crowd. Intellectual loneliness is the stage where the mind grows so loud that the heart goes silent. But that silence is not peace. It is the echo of a soul that has not yet learned how to stop understanding and start feeling. Perhaps only when they finally pause, lower the volume of intellect, and listen to their own fragility, will they realize intelligence was never the problem, only the lack of courage to be real. And when the storm of reason finally quiets, there remains only stillness, where the smart child sits with themselves, weary yet awake. That is the moment they realize everything they once chased to prove their worth only took them further from who they truly are. If intellectual loneliness is the peak of the mind overpowering the heart, then the surrender of the ego is the beginning of inner freedom. Alan Watts once said, "The real you is not a puppet which life pushes around. The real, deep-down you is the whole universe." Your true self is not the puppet of life's circumstances. It is the rhythm of the universe itself, flowing, breathing, and endlessly becoming. To flow with life, you must first let go of the label. The smart kid. To merge with the current of life, the first step is not to become smarter, but to let go of the title, the smart kid. Because only when you release the image you've been clinging to can you finally live as yourself. In that moment, they understand. Being special is not a badge to be protected, but a natural state that arises when one lives truthfully. Instead of building identity around superiority, they begin to build it around growth, effort, and humanity, things simple yet far more enduring than intellect itself. Alan Watts once said in a famous lecture, "Stop measuring days by degree of productivity and start experiencing them by degree of presence." That is the essence of liberation, not chasing efficiency, but returning to presence. For when we are fully present, we no longer need to prove our worth. We become the worth itself. They learn that being ordinary is not a failure, but a profound kind of victory. Because in ordinariness, we begin to see the miracle in every moment. They no longer strive to impress, but to show up truthfully, even with their cracks, their weakness, their imperfections. And it is precisely there that a quiet healing begins, from reason back to emotion, from ego back to existence. The message of this journey is both simple and profound. Don't try to be impressive. Try to be real. Your value doesn't come from being exceptional, but from being human enough to show up, even imperfectly. This is not merely advice for the smart kid, but for all of us. For everyone who once tied their worth to an image they thought they needed to be loved. As Alan Watts reminded us, you are something the universe is doing, in the same way that a wave is something the ocean is doing. We don't need to be great to be worthy. We only need to dare to exist, as a wave, honest, humble, and alive. When the smart kid finally learns to let go of that name, another door opens, the door back to being human. From that point on, the journey is no longer about intellect, but about emotional maturity, a hidden coming of age within the adult mind. Because in truth, each of us was once a smart kid in our own way. Not because we were always exceptional, but because we were taught that only when we excelled, we deserved to be loved. From that belief, we learned to live for recognition instead of living to be real. Alan Watts once said, "The harder we try to be something, the more we distance ourselves from what we already are. The more we try to become someone, the further we drift from the person already breathing within us, here and now." This story, therefore, isn't just for those once called smart. It's for all who have ever placed their worth in achievement, feared vulnerability, or forgotten how to simply be human. Because behind every ambition for success lies a profoundly human fear, the fear of not being enough. We believe that once we reach a certain height, we'll find peace. But as Watts said, you can never get enough of what you don't really want. We never truly crave recognition. We crave acceptance, the feeling of belonging to this life itself. And that is the paradox this story seeks to touch. The path of growth is not a journey toward greatness, but a return to humanness, sincere, fragile, yet vibrantly alive. We don't need to understand everything to be at peace. We only need to pause, breathe, and realize we are enough, even when imperfect. Alan Watts once said words that awakened millions. You are under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago. And that is the true miracle of existence. We can begin again at any moment, as long as we dare to shed the mask of who we're supposed to be and live as who we are, right now. So, You Were the Smart Kid is not really a story about intelligence. It's a story about forgiving yourself. A reminder that your worth was never in how much you could understand, but in how deeply you could feel. Not in how special you are, but in how present you can be, amidst all the uncertainty of life. And when you can do that, you are not just intelligent, you are awake.